It's a Saturday morning in France, the beginning of the school holidays, and 14-year-old Mario Leblanc is collected by taxi from Lyon Airport, eager to spend the spring break with his mother, stepfather, and 3 half-siblings at their luxury Alpine chalet. He's excited. He hasn't seen his mother in more than 2 months. She always calls him during the 2-hour drive to the village of Grand-Bornand. But this time, there is no call. When Mario arrives at the chalet, he finds it locked, and there's no answer. He's not too worried. The family often skis on the weekends. But after waiting in the cold for 3 hours, he leaves a note on the door and heads over to the home of a neighbour. Assuming there'd been some sort of mix-up with the dates, she lets him stay the night. The following morning, Mario finds a way inside the chalet through a set of sliding doors, and he's greeted not by a scene of horror, but by one of eeriness. It's daylight, but the curtains are drawn and the lights are on. Dinner is in a large pot on the stove waiting to be heated, and signs of a recent fire are in the fireplace. But there's silence, no sign of forced entry or of a struggle, no blood or broken objects, nothing at all. In fact, everything is strangely, impeccably clean and neat. Odd given 3 young children live there. The family appears to have left in a hurry. 2 laptops are still open and switched on. Mario notices the cushions are laid flat in unusual rows on the sofa. But what he finds even stranger is what he discovers in the upstairs bedrooms. All of the beds are without sheets or pillowcases. Anxious, Mario alerts the police. He insists there's no way his mother would go somewhere without telling him, or at the very least leaving some information. And it's clear from the fridge full of food and the ready-made dinner that they had planned to be there. So where did the Flactif family go? Bonjour, je m'appelle Steve, and that about exhausts my knowledge of French. Yes, today we are going continental, to the land of baguettes, twirly moustaches and other lazy stereotypes. And if you are French, you're probably going to know this one. Most others probably don't, and it's a fascinating, truly shocking story, with twists and turns and some incredible forensic work. So if you're interested to know more, stick around, and let's find out what happened to the Flactifs. This story begins in the foothills of the Alps, in a village nestled in a valley deep within the Haute-Savoie region of eastern France. Le Grand-Bornand is a charming, isolated hamlet with a spectacular mountain backdrop. Just a few thousand live in the traditional alpine chalets that are scattered across the rolling pastures. Not much happens through summer. It's peaceful, quiet. But in the winter, it comes alive and transforms into a picturesque ski resort, teeming with wealthy tourists. And overlooking much of the village is this beautiful 3-storey blonde wood chalet. It was home to the Flactif family, 41-year-old Xavier, his 36-year-old wife Graziella, and their 3 children, 10-year-old Sarah, Letitia, who was 9, and Gregory, 7 years old. Xavier was a shrewd businessman. He and his family moved from the north of France to Le Grand-Bornand in 1999, and over the next 4 years he left his mark on the village as a successful property developer. He'd made his money with a beautifully simple strategy. He bought inexpensive land and he built expensive ski chalets on it, which he then sold to wealthy English and Dutch investors. Xavier was an extremely flamboyant character, cheerful, sociable and exuberant. One of those larger-than-life types you can't really miss. He and his family adored life in the Alps. They spent a lot of time out on the slopes. Letitia in particular was a gifted skier, and she had the medal collection to prove it. A self-made man and proud of it, Xavier liked to show off his money. Their garage was filled with luxury cars and motorcycles. They enjoyed lavish vacations, and of course they had the largest property, which overlooked his growing empire. They'd been stocking the chalet up in preparation for a visit from Graziella's son Mario. That was of course before they mysteriously just vanished. The family wasn't the only thing missing. One of their cars was gone too. A Toyota Land Cruiser 4x4. There'd been a recent sighting of it, parked on a nearby forest road. Xavier's driving was apparently as erratic as his personality. He was known to hurtle around at high speeds, quite recklessly at times. To most, there seemed to be an obvious explanation to all of this: a car accident. Spring hadn't yet settled in and the mountain roads were winding, precarious and icy, so investigators set out to find evidence of a crash, but found nothing. No sign of the bright red car despite numerous rounds of the police helicopters. In search of clues, the gendarmes turned their attention back to the chalet, and a second search was ordered, 10 days after the family went missing, and they immediately noticed something very strange. The 2 laptops that had been right there during the initial search were now gone. Someone had been back and taken them, along with phones and a file containing legal documents and property plans. So investigators began combing Xavier's business accounts, a staggering 71 of them in total. It took weeks, but it all became clearer. The Flactifs had fled the country. It turned out that Xavier Flactif was far from squeaky clean. As they dug deeper, they found that all of the recent business accounts were in his wife's name. Why? Well, in 1998, while still living in the north of France, Xavier had been banned from running a business for 10 years. He'd been caught cooking the books and was convicted of tax fraud. And to make matters worse, down in Grand-Bornand, he wasn't doing anywhere near as well as he liked to make it appear. In fact, he was up to his eyeballs in debt, to the tune of almost €3 million, and they weren't even sure if they'd discovered all of the bank accounts, there were so many. But one of the most compelling pieces of evidence came right before the family disappeared. Xavier had been refused planning permission for an enormous real estate project in a nearby village, but the problem was he'd already pocketed money for a number of the proposed buildings. Quite simply, he'd been selling property that he didn't even have permission to build yet. In a statement, police described Xavier as a brilliant schemer, but one with a habit of handling money that wasn't his, and everything was pointing to the fact that he and his family had skipped the country, taken French leave, quite literally, and slipped away without so much as an au revoir. Oh, and this was all before they discovered the missing Toyota Land Cruiser. It was 50 kilometres away, across the border, in Switzerland, abandoned in a multi-storey car park at Geneva Airport. The investigation continued within Grand-Bornand, and the more the police spoke to locals, the more they came to realise just how unpopular Xavier was in the village. Alongside his growing pile of debt, he had a growing pile of enemies. There were those who seemed jealous of his apparent success, others who thought he was arrogant, and many who felt wronged by his business practices. One villager told Le Parisien he didn't have many friends here, and that's an understatement. He ripped a few people off and was flashy with his money. If the family had indeed fled, they'd evidently left in a hurry, and the rumour was that Xavier had been chased out of town, on the run after some business deal had gone sour, because allegedly Xavier Flactif's unscrupulous ways extended far beyond tax evasion. He had a reputation of stepping on others in order to get ahead, and so ruthless was he at buying up land he was even accused of driving up prices in the area. Then there were the illegal rentals, the half-finished work, the unpaid labourers. He'd pissed a lot of people off, and he'd recently fallen victim to a string of targeted incidents, vandalism, theft. Someone had even set fire to one of his chalets under construction. It seemed there was no shortage of people who might have wanted him gone. And speculation ran rampant, spilling into the mainstream media until there was a frenzy surrounding the mystery. Headlines painted Xavier as a charismatic conman on the run, and Grand-Bornand was swarmed by news and TV crews. On France's primary station, neighbours spoke openly about Xavier's ruthless reputation, and what might have become of the family. In the end, it seemed the entire country was enthralled by the story, eager to know just what had happened to the Flactifs. All signs seemed to point to the family leaving their home suddenly and unexpectedly, and jumping on a flight from Switzerland. But I know you. I know what you're thinking. There's more to this than meets the eyeballs, Steve. And you'd be right. And Mario knew this too. He was insistent that even if his mother had been forced to flee, she would have found a way to warn him. And since investigators couldn't rule out foul play, a far deeper forensic search of the chalet took place, a month after the disappearance. The evidence crew swarmed the property, searching each room inch by inch. And they discovered minuscule fragments of what looked like sharp porcelain, much of it by the children's beds. One of the detectives described it as though very thin glass had splintered, but the truth turned out to be much more disturbing when the particles were later analysed in the crime lab. It was tooth enamel. They were microscopic fragments of children's teeth. Buried between the slats of the floor, one tooth was discovered almost intact. Dental records were able to determine this was one of 7-year-old Gregory's molars. Beneath a curtain in the living room, something else was found. a single spent 6.35mm shell casing, but there were no bullet holes. The evidence crew also noted that on one of the staircases, a small square of carpet had been neatly cut out. As for the rest of the chalet, they could see that it had been meticulously cleaned, but a closer inspection of some of the surfaces yielded tiny brown flecks that looked like traces of dried blood, particularly in between the floorboards. It was becoming clearer that they were dealing with a violent crime scene. After these initial findings, police enlisted the help of the Specialist Forensic Science Unit, who arrived the following day, and they brought with them what was, at the time, a brand new substance in the world of forensic blood detection: Blue Star. Blue Star is a luminol-based formula capable of detecting even the faintest traces of blood, revealing bloodstains that have even been thoroughly cleaned and washed away. Its extreme sensitivity allows it to detect blood diluted up to 1 part in 100,000. A chemical reaction with the iron found in hemoglobin causes it to glow bright blue. The forensic unit sprayed the chalet's interior surfaces with the Blue Star, turning off the lights to see the results. Bingo. The kitchen lit up like a Christmas tree. In fact, the Blue Star painted a scene of horror. Blood all over the beautiful chalet. On the walls, floors, tables, by the kids' beds. There were even drag marks in blood leading up the basement steps. There was blood everywhere. Blood that someone had gone to great lengths to scrub clean. But a violent drama had clearly unfolded in this chalet, and this blew the case wide open. The gendarme now had definitive evidence that the Flactif family had come to harm inside their home, and with the amount of blood present, the search for the missing family shifted into a full-blown murder investigation. All of this meant that Xavier's car was likely placed at Geneva Airport to make it look as though the family had fled the country. It was next to get their forensic treatment, and like the chalet, it had been thoroughly washed. The boot or trunk carpet had also been carefully cut away with a sharp blade. More blood was discovered. Between the chalet and the car, over 1,000 pieces of evidence were obtained and sent to the crime lab for testing. Samples of blood were found containing DNA from all 5 members of the Flactif family. But that wasn't all. A 6th person's blood was also present in both locations. By now, 80 members of the French police force were involved in some capacity with the case that continued to be a national obsession in France. Speculation ran wild about what the media dubbed La fameuse sixième trace, or the famous 6th trace. Was this person an additional unknown victim, the culprit? And if the Flactifs were indeed dead, where were their bodies? Caves and waterways were searched by specialist forces. Sniffer dogs and helicopters scoured the region all throughout summer, but they found nothing. Meanwhile, police began obtaining DNA samples, starting with remaining members of the family and working outwards through neighbours, business associates and former employees. More than 300 saliva swabs were sent for analysis. Providing a DNA sample wasn't mandatory, but everyone cooperated, apart from one person who flatly refused. A local mechanic and neighbour, 31-year-old David Otya. Look familiar? He was the one who'd appeared on French TV shortly after the disappearance, as did his partner, Alexandre Lefebvre, a former cleaning employee for the Flactifs. Both were tenants of a chalet owned by the missing family, and their open hatred towards Xavier on that show had already roused some suspicion with the French police force. But there was something he said to the reporter that really struck a chord with the detectives. There may have been carnage in there. This was long before any blood had been discovered. As the investigation unfolded, they'd been keeping a keen eye on the couple, and David had taken an unhealthy interest in the goings-on at the Flactif home, using binoculars to watch forensics teams work. But the thing is, they already knew he would refuse to provide a DNA sample. They'd been tapping his phone for a while, and heard him telling Alexandra he was going to give them the brush off. David was told by the gendarme that refusing to provide a DNA sample made him look awfully guilty, so he eventually relented and offered one. And 48 hours later, the results came back. It was a match. But why would a man attack his neighbours and their 3 young children? Investigators began to look into David Otya's background. Like the Flactifs, he and Alexandra were originally from the north of France, from Chalet. They had 2 young children together and had moved to Grand-Bornand in 2001, seeking a fresh start. David had no criminal record and was described as quiet and hard-working. Between his job as a mechanic and Alexandra's as a cleaner, they earned a modest income. Living in Le Grand-Bornand stretched their finances, and they'd never quite managed to fit into the close-knit community. Obviously, they had enough evidence to charge David Otje with the suspected murder of the entire Flactif family, but the detectives decided not to rush in. They wanted to be certain Alexandra was involved, as they suspected. Instead, they continued to wiretap his phone, and on August 14th, 4 months after the family vanished, they intercepted a conversation between the couple. Alexandra told David that she hadn't been feeling well since April. "With what happened in April, we should be careful, David, because our lives could be ruined all of a sudden." Over the following month, even more evidence came to light. Other phone calls between the pair implicated another local couple, Stefan and Isabel Haremza. They were concerned the Haremzas wouldn't keep their mouths shut. Early on September 16th, the police made their move. David was stopped on his way to work, pulled from his car, and arrested for the murders. At the same time, officers raided his home and arrested Alexandra. Their 2 young children were taken into care. The police also arrested Stefan and Isabel Haremza. They were suspected of helping cover up the crime. Faced with the DNA evidence, David Otje cracked within 30 minutes of questioning. He confessed that he'd gone to the chalet to discuss matters with Xavier. According to David, the property developer owed him some money for some odd jobs he'd done, as well as a few hours of cleaning work Alexandra had completed at the chalet. It turned into a heated argument, and David pulled out a pistol he'd brought for intimidation, but the gun went off accidentally, killing Xavier instantly. In a panic, David decided to kill the witnesses, shooting each of the Flactif family members one by one. He then wrapped the bodies in the bed sheets from upstairs and loaded them into the largest car in the garage, the 4x4. He then scrubbed the house clean, collected several canisters of petrol, and drove 10 kilometers to the woods of nearby Tone. There he burned all 5 bodies. To throw off the investigation, he abandoned the car at Geneva Airport. David claimed he'd acted alone. The detectives couldn't believe what they were hearing. He'd wiped out an entire family for what amounted to nothing more than a few €100, but something troubled them about the confessions of his suspected accomplices. Their statements mirrored David's so closely that it felt as though they'd been rehearsed. David guided the gendarme to a remote spot in the woods of Tone and to the site of the fire pit. It had been 5 months since the fire. There they found very little evidence of the Flactif family. Among the remnants were just ash, fragments of bone, and the rim from Sarah's glasses. According to David, it took roughly 3 hours for the fire to completely consume the family. Experts knew this was impossible, so they decided to conduct an experiment. They recreated the fire using pig carcasses, common in forensic reconstruction due to their similar properties to human tissue. In 3 hours, the pigs were only 20% cremated. Experts determined that to fully destroy the bodies, the fire would need to be enormous, requiring about 800 kilograms of wood and taking approximately 2 days. This pyre would have to have been prepared in advance. It was no argument gone wrong at all. It was a premeditated family annihilation. David maintained that he acted alone, but it would be impossible for one man to achieve what he had in such a limited time frame. Cleaning all of the blood from the chalet was described as a monstrous task, moving the 5 bodies all alone, dragging each of them into the Tone forest, gathering the best part of a ton of wood, and tending to the fire for days. It all confirmed their suspicions. David Otje could not have acted alone. Since they knew the murders were no accident, the investigation turned to uncovering the true motives, and thankfully, with this new evidence, the accomplices began to talk. And they were surprised to hear that David and Xavier had once been friends. They shared similar backgrounds. Both were from the north of France with modest upbringings, but Xavier seemed to accumulate wealth easily, while David often struggled to make ends meet. And what began as admiration quickly turned into bitter jealousy. Both he and Alexandra grew obsessed with the Flactif's material success, their lifestyle, their flashy cars, their large home. They began to resent all the family had that they did not. They wanted the luxury that their landlord flaunted. But there's more to the story of Xavier and the couple. The crooked property developer was the reason they were in Le Grand-Bornand in the first place. They were lured in by an ad promising a dream home in the Alps, but when they arrived, Xavier told them their chalet wasn't ready. David and Alexandra were forced to move between smaller properties, and the truth was they would never set foot in that dream chalet. Xavier rented it out to wealthy tourists instead. But it wasn't just David and Alexandra who felt wronged. Stefan and Isabel Haremza had also come from the north and were equally disillusioned by life in the Alps. The four became close friends and began to bond over their mutual disdain for Xavier. What started as casual gossip evolved into something more sinister. They even began making jokes about murdering him, until the grim jokes turned serious. They were intoxicated by jealousy, and the resentment brewed over months, bubbling over into a vengeful obsession. They tried to sabotage Xavier. It started petty, graffiti, siphoning his gas, but it soon began to escalate. They doused his car in petrol, and it was David and Stefan who'd set fire to one of his chalets. According to Alexandra, the situation intensified in January when David watched a documentary about Alfredo Stranieri, an Italian serial killer who murdered victims he met through classified ads to steal their property. After this, David became fixated on the idea of making Xavier and his family disappear. He said to Alexandra, "Stranieri is an idiot who got caught because he buried the bodies. They won't find anything at my place, because I'll burn them." The murders were indeed premeditated, ruminated on for months. Stefan revealed that the original plan was to murder the family on April 9th, 2 days earlier. The plan was simple but brutal. Stefan would strangle the children with a rope he'd brought, and David would shoot the parents. But when they arrived at the chalet, Stefan lost his nerve and backed out. An argument ensued, with David accusing Stefan of cowardice. Then David decided that April 11th would be the day, and he went alone. The murders were motivated by envy, hatred and greed. David wanted what Xavier had, so he took it, and his family was collateral damage. Alexandra played a big part in planning the murders. The Haremzas helped him prepare and conceal the evidence. At their home, police found DVDs, a camcorder and computer equipment that belonged to the Flactifs. In David Otya's home, investigators uncovered a forged lease for one of Xavier's chalets, the final part of the cunning plan. They also found expensive ski equipment and various personal items stolen from the family, but perhaps most troubling of all, toys belonging to the children. What kind of monster gives the toys of murdered children to their own kids? We now know the murders of the Flactif family were driven by greed, envy and bitterness. But what really happened at their chalet on April 11th, 2003? Investigators were left with only fragments of evidence: teeth, faint bloodstains, gunpowder traces and cell phone records. But they were determined to reconstruct the family's final moments. Using cutting-edge laser technology to analyse blood patterns, corroborated by statements from David's accomplices, they managed to piece together a comprehensive timeline. The children arrived home from school at around 5:10 p.m. Phone records indicate they were still alive at 5:29, but not for long. David entered the property shortly after. He found Gregory and Sarah snacking at the dining table. 7-year-old Gregory was first to be killed. Contrary to what David claimed, not all of the victims were shot. Blood from a firearm leaves a vaporized pattern, like a mist. Gregory's blood spatter, along with 7 fragments of baby teeth, proved he was killed by repeated blows from a blunt object, most likely a piece of firewood, which was then burned in the fireplace. 10-year-old Sarah witnessed her brother's murder and tried to escape through the front door, but David caught up with her and she too was bludgeoned to death. A projection of her blood was discovered at head height on the wall. David then made his way upstairs where he discovered 9-year-old Letitia hiding behind her sister's bed. She'd evidently heard the screams of her siblings. She was also killed by blows from a blunt weapon. Meanwhile, Graziella had been in the basement laundry room, unable to hear the commotion. She was executed on the stairs as she made her way back to the chalet, leaving blood spatter indicative of repeated blows to a bloody face. The telltale drag marks on the staircase, they were left when David brought her body back up the stairs. One small mercy, Graziella was killed unaware of the horror of what had happened to her children. According to his phone records, Xavier arrived home at 6:45 p.m. Upon entering the chalet, he saw the bodies of his family and David Otya. Powder particles found on the armchairs and curtains show he was killed with the pistol, the only victim who was shot. David had a gun but chose to bludgeon the children. This is sadism. I think he relished it. He took his anger out on innocent members of this family. According to Stefan, he and David spent the next couple of days building and tending to the fire in the woods. David sent the pistol, which belonged to a relative of Alexandra, to his brother in the north and asked him to make it disappear. It was later recovered from a river. A month after his arrest, David retracted his confession and changed his story. Instead, he presented a highly unlikely scenario. He claimed he'd arrived at the chalet to speak with Xavier, but discovered two unknown individuals had already murdered the family. Under duress, they coerced him into helping them dispose of the bodies. This story obviously falls apart quickly under the weight of all the evidence. Nonetheless, he stuck with it all the way to trial. David Otya underwent 3 psychological evaluations, which revealed traits of narcissism, avoidance and compulsiveness. He was a control freak, particularly prone to extreme actions. His ability to compartmentalize his feelings and avoid difficult situations made him an exceptionally dangerous individual. Despite claims of impaired consciousness during the crimes, psychiatrists found no evidence of any mental disorder that would lessen his responsibility. The trial began on June 12, 2006. During the proceedings, it emerged that Xavier and his family had faced significant racial abuse while living in Grand-Bornand, which is abhorrent. This led some to believe that the murders could have been racially motivated, but the official motive throughout the trial was cited as jealousy and greed. At the end of the 3-week trial, David Otya was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. Stefan Haremza received 15 years for his part in the crimes. Alexandra Lefebvre was accused of being somewhat of the mastermind behind the murders, and of having blown on the embers and cleaned up the ashes. She was sentenced to 10 years. Isabelle Haremza received 7 years. Mikhail Otya, David's brother, was sentenced to 1 year of probation for disposing of a murder weapon. David initially appealed the court's decision the following year, but he withdrew his appeal on the first day of the new trial. Today, the 3 accomplices have served their time and are free. David Otya, now 51, has displayed exemplary behaviour in prison and is eligible for parole consideration in 2025. Recently, Mario, Graziella's only surviving child, spoke to TF1. For a long time, he'd thought about what might have been had he been at the chalet that day. I was supposed to arrive on Friday, but I was going to miss a day of school, and my father refused. I should have arrived on Friday at noon, but I wouldn't be here to talk about it now. If I had been there, maybe I could have gotten some of them out. If I had been there, maybe I would have alerted someone, gotten the children out. My only question now is, how does it come to this? I don't understand what leads someone to kill 2 people and 3 children out of jealousy, out of hatred. I tell myself that even after 22 years in prison, his debt isn't paid, because we are going to live with this until we disappear too. When he has served his sentence, I will still be serving mine. And that's the tragic story of the Flactif family annihilation. It's a case that's hard to comprehend. How do 4 individuals facilitate such a despicable crime? How does the hatred of one man result in the murder of his wife and 3 young children? They were guilty of nothing. As always, thank you so much for stopping by. If you found this video insightful, please take a moment to give it a quick like and consider subscribing for more. And hopefully I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.